Broken Brain is sponsored by Givaderm, excellent and 100% natural skincare products. Go to www.givaderm.com. Make sure to use the code BrokenBrain at checkout for a 10% discount.
The Broken Brain.
Recording in progress.
And here we go. We're back with the Broken Brain today. Really want to welcome everybody back. And I want to throw out also a quick thank you to those who participated and listened and watched the live stream that we did for International Overdose Awareness Day a week or so ago. I don't remember when September started, but that happened. And I'm really grateful for people tuning in for that. I am really grateful as well to be joined by Thais Gibson today, who's a pastoral counselor here to talk to us about all things attachment theory, attachment styles, attachment. Haven't done an episode on that in a while. And at the same time, it is so vitally important to development that it's important. I don't know why it's been so long. And so, but it paved the way for us to have this conversation today. Thais, welcome to the Broken Brain.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
Would you go ahead and introduce people to you and just tell them a little bit about your background and how you got into this murky business of counseling that we're all in?
So I would definitely say it started with a personal journey. I definitely went through a lot of big sort of childhood attachment challenges myself. Saw a really, really messy divorce, lots of chaos in my home on and off growing up. And I think I, from a very young age, was sort of like, why does it have to be this way? Why can't there be an easier way if people love each other? And really wondering about that. I was an athlete in school, and to make a very long story short, I basically had a knee surgery my scouting year. I played soccer and was going to a D1 school and got addicted to opiates after that. So summer before 10th grade, went down about a 6-year journey of almost daily opiate use and was fairly high functioning enough to go off to school. But in one of my psych classes one day, somebody said to me, well, the conscious mind can't outwill or overpower the subconscious mind. And for me, that really illustrated this painful journey that I was on, where if anybody's ever struggled with addiction or any kind of really painful habit, you're all the time telling yourself, this is it, this is the end, I'm not going to do this again. And yet you go back and go back and go back. And that line really hit me in a profound way, because I realized, it's not that I'm weak or not good enough or a failure that I can't kick this habit. It's actually something happening between my conscious and subconscious mind. So I became extremely interested in that topic, and went on to stick around in school for quite some time, but also did about 13 different certifications, starting with hypnosis, NLP, a lot of these sorts of dynamics. Not so that I could then use those to hypnotize people and do that kind of work so much, but because I was truly deeply interested in understanding how the subconscious mind worked. So went down that path, started giving a lot of free workshops to people because I got sober and I felt like I had to tell everybody that the ticket to change and to healing has a lot to do with your subconscious mind. So I did that, built a really busy client practice with about a 2-year wait list, and then got to the point of going, well, this isn't scalable. Like, I can't get this information out to enough people. So we packaged it into courses and built the personal development school. So that's sort of been the trajectory.
And that's what you do now, right? A lot of that. Do you still do clinical practice too, by the way? I'm just curious.
No, I do not. Our school has about 8,000 students in it right now. And we've got a lot of building and a lot of people coming in and out of there. So I work with people in the context of just doing webinars. So I do 4 webinars a week in there and work on the business side of things as well. But I miss seeing people one-to-one. I really do. But it just became like unmanageable with how busy things were.
Well, and I guess I should amend my terminology. That's still very clinical. You're doing, I'm group level, instruction level, that kind of not just psychoeducation, but all of those elements are also still very clinical. But I know what you mean. And actually, that's a really good We are bad at that in our industry, by the way, of being like, I'm going to launch this new thing. I'm going to do this. It's this whole new full-time enterprise, but of course I'll still keep my practice open. And it's like, robbing Peter to pay Paul time and energy wise, or
I did that for a while. You really nailed that. I did that for a while until it was like, oh my gosh, like this is not manageable for how busy things are. So
right.
yeah, learn that one the hard way.
I think a lot about I think it's a Ron Swanson quote for those. I said I think, so I sound a little less nerdy. It is a quote from Parks and Rec, where just this line of dialogue where it says, don't half-ass two things, whole-ass one thing. And so anyway, but we're speaking of addiction, we are bad at that in our industry. We take on too much sometimes. As you mentioned, there's a lot of things that are very interesting as we're getting into attachment, because you mentioned trauma, you mentioned addiction, and I think also a really important part of all mental health things. And you're saying that saying that you mentioned, it reminds me so much of, I had an appointment sitting with my own prescriber who prescribes me my psychiatric health medication. And he said to me, yeah, you always try to outsmart your mental health symptoms. You need to make sure that you're treating them also. And this is not long ago that he said this to me. This is like, I work in the field, right? We're smart, and yet we still fall into traps of this. Can you say the saying one more time that you said about the conscious
mind can't outwill or overpower the subconscious mind?
Absolutely. The subconscious mind is so interesting. And I think attachment theory is really all about like sort of the foundational mental health. I want to say springboard, basically, where it ties in with so many presenting problems, as we call them, right? It's the foundation of the house of the mental health. There we go. That's a metaphor I just made up. And now you can amend it and change it if you don't like it.
And I agree. I really agree with that. I think what happens is, you think of a child and they say our attachment style develops originally, according to the original work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, between the ages of 0 to 2 years old. And, between the ages of 0 to 8, but especially 0 to 3, we're basically only producing mostly alpha and theta brainwaves, which are the brainwaves we actually need to be hypnotized. So we're essentially these little sponges when we're children, and we're intaking all of this information, and it's forming all of our deep subconscious perceptions. And our subconscious mind stores everything. It consolidates memories over time, but it stores them nonetheless. And it stores them with a lot of the emotion intact from the actual experiences. And so we have this experience of, growing up and, what we learn about love and connection and relationships and what they should look like and what we should expect and what we should need and how we should rely on people. We're really intaking all this information, sponging it right up. It sort of forms this lens. Like, I like to think of our subconscious as being the lens that you see the world through. So if you, for example, saw a tremendous amount of fighting in your home, you think love is pain, love is fighting. If you saw a lot of avoidance in your home and a lot of, emotional disconnect or emotions even being shamed, you think emotions are shameful. And these are the things that we believe, and these constructs exist deeply. And then we know, research shows very conclusively, your subconscious mind is responsible for 95 to 97% of your beliefs, your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions, and your conscious is 3 to 5%. So if we don't address a lot of those painful limiting beliefs or unmet needs or emotional regulation issues at the subconscious level and actually work to recondition those patterns, then we can keep trying to outwill at this conscious mind perspective without actually using tools that apply to the subconscious. And it can feel very limiting in the process.
That's so interesting. I had heard before some people say that a lot of the conscious decision-making that we're aware of is actually just our brain sort of justifying what our subconscious is already telling it to do. And that kind of matches what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes. And so neuroscience proved that every single decision we make is emotional. Even people who think they're logical, rational thinkers are making, it was a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, are making very emotionally based decisions at the tipping point and then just quick to rationalize through logic thereafter. And so that's what we're doing. And when you look at the context of where a lot of those emotions coming from, it's coming from our stored perceptions from previous events that are existing at a subconscious level. So if I believe, because let's say, I was a fearful avoidant attachment style, which, usually has a lot of trust issues growing up and things like that. So if I believe I can't trust people when I get close to them, right, which was a belief I carried for a very long time, then when somebody does get close to me, am not making a decision based on the objective content of the decision as much as there's a lot of subjectivity playing into it, because I have a belief system that's producing this emotional output that says, oh, but this person's, you're getting too close to them. You can't trust them. So now you have to push them away. It's coming from my subjective interpretation of the content rather than necessarily the objective content itself.
Wow. I think about this a lot. One of the ways I've seen it emerge itself is that we can get so invested in this idea that I am logical. And as you put it, one of the problems with that, of course, is that we then think we are objectively correct. I think of this sometimes, the example of the, let's say, stereotypical dad who is like going to yell at everybody for a lamp being left on or the thermostat being 1 degree off because I've sat down and calculated the cost of the amps that are, or whatever. I'm not really an electrician here, obviously, but of how that is. Or we got to go, when we go to the store, we got to buy the cereal that comes in bags instead of boxes. Oddly enough, a big conflict sometimes. And the problem with that thinking is that because it's logical, this costs less, it has to do with money, whatever. I believe I am objectively correct and everybody else is emotional in their decision making. But it's not that everyone else isn't emotional in their decision making then, is what you're saying. It's that I have to accept that I am also. Even if there's those numbers there's some value, there's some attachment thing subconsciously, and it causes me to discount other values that might be more important, like yelling at my kids every day might have a cost also.
So there's 2 layers to that, right? There's like the deepest layer, which is that people are also wired differently to prioritize different things because we all have different subconscious needs. So, some people might be too busy trying to make sure that the rest of the house is clean or that the kids are happy to be paying attention to those smaller things. And so their subconscious is actually skewed towards just different priorities. We all have subconscious specific individual needs that drive us. And our reticular activating system in our brain will actually filter out information according to that stuff. So, we'll have sort of a filtering system. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is like, if somebody wants to work on, changing the heat or the thermostat, how are they responding to that? If somebody's like just gently reminding and being healthy in that case, then okay, they're taking a healthy action based on something that makes logical sense. But if somebody is yelling at the kids, then we lost the plot, right? We're now trying to do something to produce benefit over here while producing detriment on the other side of it. And if somebody's not able to self-observe and gain insight into how they're reacting to things, what's probably happening in that kind of situation too, just to give context, is like, let's say that this man who's the logical father, let's say he's, really worried about the extra degree of the thermostat. And let's say, that has merit, right? It saves money. But if his relationship to it is that as a child himself, part of his attachment challenges were that he grew up in a household that was impoverished and struggling, and he had a lot of lack mentality and lack beliefs, which would make justified sense. He might make it mean, well, if we run out of money, I'm unsafe, right? Because maybe he felt unsafe in childhood. So he sees the thermostat. His subconscious perceives the thermostat not as the objective thermostat, but as, my family, making us all unsafe because they're not taking accountability for money. That stored subconscious belief of I am unsafe when he perceives the thermostat that way subjectively then produces this emotional output of feeling frustrated or out of control. And then he projects his frustrations by yelling. It's like the whole experience is not the thermostat itself. Like everything affects us based on our subjective interpretation according to past subconscious storage.
One of my first introductions to mental health was just an undergraduate psychology course, and the guy teaching it was very much a cognitive behavioral therapist. And this is, by the way, a while ago. So let me just put so this is probably the late 90s, okay? And I remember him bringing up the idea in the class that there was some debate over whether or not the subconscious even existed. And now, as you put it, like neuroscience and all these things, we talk about it a lot nowadays, right?
Absolutely.
And originally, like one of the problems I think that the CBTers of the world had with it was the original belief was you just cannot access it. Psychoanalysis had some ideas that if you talk in certain ways for a long amount of time, you would influence, but subconscious is not accessible to us. And I feel like from what you're talking about is like, actually, that's not the case.
Not true.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things. So there's a couple distinctions to make. So there's a difference between the subconscious mind and unconscious mind. And I think that people often use them interchangeably. The slight difference is that the subconscious is actually the space you can retrieve information from. It's just out of your conscious awareness, whereas your unconscious, it's a lot more difficult too. And so if you think for an example, let's say somebody drove home from work. On the way home, they got into a really bad mood. They, went home, drank a bunch of wine or binge ate a whole bunch of food, or, they have this sort of painful coping mechanism. It's not in your conscious awareness on the drive home per se. It can be for some people that, why they got into a bad mood. But if they realize, okay, you know what? On the way leaving work, my coworker gave me some feedback, and I realized that, what I'm feeling is that my coworker gave me feedback. I took it as criticism, and I actually have decades of criticism from both of my parents, and I would feel really small and I would feel really helpless when that happened. We can start, inferring and making these connections through introspection. And people will be able to resonate with that. They'll be able to say, you know what? No wonder criticism hurts Bob so badly, where it doesn't hurt Mary much at all, because they have different relationships and experiences. And we can retrieve that information from our subconscious mind. So even though it's out of our conscious mind's awareness, we can actually get access to that through introspective work.
Yeah. So when we talk about the even just the underlying values, which we can pull out and identify, it's funny, going back to the stereotype dad example, he might even be aware, oh, yeah, I grew up poor, so we're not wasting money in my house. And he might even say that, but it still might be a somewhat subconscious,
Absolutely.
At least the drive and the objectivity that he might believe it has.
Exactly. Like he may know that about himself, but in real time, it's out of his periphery, right? It's like in real time when he's yelling at his kids, what's actually happening beneath the surface is he sees the thermostat. He's not seeing the thermostat as the objective thermostat. He's seeing his objective interpretations about the meaning about that. And so he sees the thermostat as, oh, I'm out of control, or I'm unsafe, or you name it, based on the person, right? It's always individual and unique to the person. But the meaning creates this emotional response. The emotional response creates the behavioral response. And you know this from like the sort of CBT dynamics as well. But this is actually happening all on autopilot beneath. These are not conscious mind experiences. He's not looking at the thermostat going, oh, I feel frustrated and angry in real time. I will now go choose consciously to yell at my children. Like these are not conscious decisions.
Especially the self dialogue is probably not, I will now irrationally, disproportionately react to this with anger, and in a way that is not really justified, and in the long run is more costly in my relationships, perhaps than I'm saving on money.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so those are the things that are subconscious and retrievable. Unconscious mind is much trickier. And a lot of arguments are that you can access that under a state of hypnosis, things of that nature, these very deep, old kind of memories that may be in there, especially at particularly young ages. Your unconscious mind rules some other dynamics as well. But it's the subconscious out of the periphery, the lack of self-observation of all the things that are happening in real time, that is where the juice of everything is. Because if we can tackle that stuff and recondition those ideas about ourselves being unsafe or out of control, and we can recondition our behaviors in the way that we deal with things, instead of yelling at the children, I practice conflict communication, or I share more vulnerably about what this means to me. Like this is how we restructure a lot of these different things.
So all these years then, and I'm not going to blame Dr. Selgus for this, whoever he is out there, my former teacher. But all these years I've been sort of operating under this kind of thought process that's incorrect. I'm learning something right now about the subconscious and all the things I was throwing under the umbrella of that definition, that you've just defined it in a much more useful way, I think. That's very cool.
Thank you.
How I wanted to introduce a little bit of the idea of attachment and what attachment theory is and what kind of attachment styles. I assume everybody out there are big fans of what is it called? A Child Goes to Hospital, right? John Bowlby's documentary about attachment. Just kidding. Nobody remembers that probably, but some of the attachment theorists in the early days kind of built off of, like so many did, the psychoanalysis and some of those first theories, and they took it deeper to say what's actually happening instead of some of that armchair research.
Absolutely. So a little bit about that stuff. So, obviously, if anybody's not familiar, attachment theory is the original work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, as I was mentioning earlier, and they did a lot of really remarkable work in terms of being able to determine attachment styles. And they had something called the strange situation experiment, where they would leave children in this room and have the parent leave, and they would see the child's response both to the parent leaving, but also to the parent when the parent returned. And based on that, they could categorize different attachment styles. And there's so much powerful work about that. And we'll go through the 4 different attachment styles. But one thing that I personally saw that was kind of missing was the idea of, okay, we have an attachment style. We're not born with one. It gets conditioned into us through our experiences. Can we change it? Can we recondition our attachment style based on the inner workings and understanding of how the subconscious mind operates? And so there's 4 attachment styles. The first attachment style is secure. It's the only secure attachment style. And essentially, some of the big mechanisms that will happen for children in order to become securely attached are, number one, their parents express a lot of approach-oriented behaviors. So if a child cries, the parents go towards the child. They try to figure out what's going on with the child. They're present is another big thing, right? So the child feels like there's a sense of attunement there. There's a sense of, as children even age into, after being a toddler, they negotiate needs with the child, right? If a child says, Mom, I want candy, it's 11 p.m., the mom doesn't have to say, okay, I'm going to give you candy and adopt a permissive style of parenting. But the parent can say to the child, you know what, honey, I know you want candy. I know candy tastes great. And you're going to have a stomach ache and you're not going to sleep. If you eat all your dinner tomorrow, we can have a little bit of candy after dinner. So there's this ability, even though the child may have unhealthy needs or preferences, the parent can negotiate while also validating the child's needs, validating the child's experience, seeing the child as a unique individual. And so these major characteristics go into a child. Essentially, if you have a lot of approach-oriented behaviors, you feel like your needs are worthy of being seen and heard. You feel comfortable communicating and expressing yourself, because when you cry, you actually get positive reinforcement from the approach-oriented behaviors from the parents. Essentially, because of these things, children grow up with a greater sense of self-worth, a greater sense of trust, and a greater ability to feel like they are worthy and deserving of their needs being met and taking up space. And if a child feels like their needs are also validated, they also feel safe expressing not only their needs to others, but their boundaries. And so we'll tend to see, this is the secure orientation of people, and they just do a lot better in relationships statistically, because that makes your relationship life much easier. And they also have, because they were attuned to, they have a more regulated nervous system as a result, and they have a greater ability to attune to others and hear people and be present with others as well. And relationships feel safe. Then we have our 3 insecurely attached styles, which are the anxious preoccupied, the dismissive avoidant, and then the fearful avoidant, also referred to as the disorganized attachment style. And for the anxious one, this will be the person you see in relationships, if your audience isn't familiar, where they are clingy sometimes. They may call a lot. They go from relationship to relationship. They can be afraid of abandonment. And essentially what happens in this individual's childhood is usually there's a lot of incongruency or inconsistency. So for example, you might have these, kind relationships to your caregivers, and they may be warm and available when they're there, but maybe they work a lot, or maybe they take trips a lot. And so there are these positive emotional associations about closeness, but they feel like they're constantly being taken away. And so it feels like there can be a real abandonment that happens, like a bad divorce and a parent leaves, but more often than not, anxious preoccupieds form because of perceived abandonment. So, parents are there, then they're gone for 11 hours, then they're there, then they're gone. And so it really dysregulates the child's nervous system, but it doesn't give enough negative emotional associations where the child just breaks off and says, okay, I'm just going to be independent. So instead, their whole personality ends up revolving around, how do I maintain proximity? How do I get closer? And they people please a lot as adults. They are boundaryless the vast majority of the time because they're scared to set boundaries and then lose somebody. Their big preoccupations and fears have to do with being abandoned, alone, rejected, excluded, not good enough. They tend to be very hard on themselves. And they tend to end up, unfortunately, being attracted to people who are quite emotionally unavailable. And so they'll see a lot of these painful dynamics in their relationships where they're terrified of this, and their worst case scenario fears come true.
And oftentimes then they're blamed for that as well, right? I mean, I don't know how many people I've worked with who've been told by loved ones, "Oh, you're just a terrible judge of people. You're just, the term a-hole magnet has been thrown around, especially and disproportionately thrown at women who are in abusive relationships. A lot of times, I've never liked that. But what you're describing here is one of the reasons that is not accurate is it might not be totally inaccurate that someone has bad judgment, but you're saying that's just a very surface level description, especially when it's all about just blaming the person, because you're talking
100%.
about the underlying reality of what drives that.
100%. And people stay for reasons that are specific to them. Like a lot of anxious preoccupied stay in bad relationships because the fear of abandonment is greater than the pain of the relationship. And so it's like the pick your poison, right? So if the pain, because we store everything subconsciously. So if we have a lot of abandonment wounding, then our subconscious essentially taps into that. Like, no, I'm not ready to relive this degree of pain again. I'd rather just stay and be unhappy than go through the full abandonment. And so it's interesting too, like when you see somebody who's anxious and they are clingy or needy in relationships, the other part I think is so, misunderstood is like, people are like, oh, they call too much. They text too often. Oh, they're too needy. And it's like, sure, they may have these expressions of those behaviors, but the reality is they're actually having a trauma response. Like when they're in this dynamic of panicking that somebody's leaving, their nervous system is dysregulated. They're in sympathetic nervous system mode. They're actually in suffering, just like all the other attachment styles have their own variations of trauma responses. So I very much agree with you that there's this sort of element of they get a hard time. And it's like, well, if you dug a little deeper, then you might see what's really going on. But most people obviously don't do that.
It's easier to blame people. Then you can just wash my hands of it and say, oh, I already told him to knock it off. Right.
Always easier to blame what we don't understand.
I do see that. And I think I cut in before you finished you said there are 3 attachment styles.
Okay, I'll go to the other one. Yeah.
But it reminds me of many times where I've worked with people with a foster or adoption scenario where maybe a child comes into their home who has a lot of trauma and things and has attachment disruption of one kind or another, of how frustrating, because as you mentioned earlier, it's not that the kid's not smart, and when they're sort of lined up, all the ducks in a row, the wind blows the right way, whatever, they have a great day, they have a great week, whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, they're lying to me, and they're lying to me in ways that are ridiculous, and they know I can disprove. And so that means they're being malicious, or somehow that means they're not intelligent, or somehow that means all these things that are not actually what's going on, because we don't understand attachment. We're not educated in it.
Absolutely. And I think that that's, it's such a great way of illustrating the difference between the conscious and subconscious mind, which is like, you look at the anxious preoccupied, how many anxious preoccupied people that you worked with have been like, I get stressed, so I shut off my phone, I put my phone away, I try to not call, and their conscious mind knows better that this is not the most adaptive behavior in this situation, but their subconscious repeats the behavior anyways, right? And it's this friction because we have these coping mechanisms that we've been programmed to try to utilize that have worked for us as children. But until we recondition them and realize, hey, what worked as a child may not be the healthiest thing for us as an adult, our subconscious is running the show. And so we'll continue down these patterns and sort of rabbit holes. And we can talk about like reprogramming and stuff at the end at some point, but important to recognize that. And so to your point as well, so the next attachment style is the fearful avoidant. So we've got the secure and then 3 insecure. So fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment style. And a great example of where somebody might become a fearful avoidant or FA is through foster care. One of many examples, the disorganized attachment style or fearful avoidant, essentially what happens to them growing up is they have a lot of chaos and a lot of big trust impact through that chaos. So, a really typical and clear example would be that, let's say the parent or the child's primary caregiver is the mom, and let's say the mother is an alcoholic. And so some days the child comes home, the mother is drinking and she's in a great mood. She's happy, she's loving, she's extra sweet, extra kind. Other days she's drinking and the child comes home and the mother is drinking too much, but she's in a really bad mood. She's scary. She's angry. Another day, mom's sobering up and she feels guilty about her behavior. So she's being extra sweet and loving and nice. Another day, mom's sobering up and she's terribly grumpy and she's harsh and cruel and critical. And so what happens is there's no ability for this child to form an organized attachment strategy because there's no order in what's happening. Everything is chaos. And so what happens as a result of this is, and this can be bad divorces, lots of fighting in the home that's really chaotic. This can be foster care and being exposed to a lot of trauma through different challenging situations like that. I mean, there's many variations of how this can take place, but the fearful, avoidant, or disorganized is characterized by having no healthy attachment strategy. So what they actually do is they become hypervigilant and they become excellent at reading between the lines and guessing what's going to happen next, because that was how they learned to sort of adapt to such a chaotic environment. And they become very sensitive to micro expressions and body language and tone of voice, but they also accumulate a lot of wounds, right? So they'll have a lot of betrayal trauma, still a lot of abandonment trauma, a lot of fear of being trapped or helpless or powerless, a lot of fear of relying on people who are unsafe, a lot of different dynamics around that. And they will be the person as an adult who's very hot and cold. So one day they're fearing abandonment. They really want the love and the connection. But then another day, the fearful avoidance, like, wait, you're too close, step back. And I sort of think of the fearful avoidant as being like, come here, get close to me. And then you get close and like, go away, stay back. And they can be very confusing
Approach
partners.
Avoidance, sometimes talked about a lot with like borderline personality disorder and some other diagnoses that touch on this. That's very interesting. Would this be the type of person who would, that while they may remain people pleasing, they also might kind of shun the idea of actually relying on anyone? So like I'm over being not the healthy kind of independence necessarily. It's like I'm over here pushing everybody away, and they're like, oh, you know, what I want to help, and you're like, no, but I'll people please and pretend that everything's okay. Okay.
Exactly. And that's not the same as our dismissive avoidant, who's like the far end of the continuum, who we could even call counter dependent, like literally will not rely on anybody at all. But the fearful avoidant is kind of that middle ground, because they have the anxious side and the avoidant side, and they will often swing back and forth at sort of the drop of a hat. So you'll see a lot of that. And then in the dismissive avoidant, we've got the really strong character of that. The dismissive avoidant tends to be the one who essentially grew up with a lot of childhood neglect, also sometimes enmeshment. And the child is basically modeled to not rely on other people because they can't rely on their caregivers. And it's really characterized by a lack of attunement, and things like emotional shaming, you know, like somebody expresses emotion, they can't. Children should be seen and not heard, or that's not something that takes place in the home. And we can have these very overt examples of childhood emotional neglect, like food's not on the table, parents never home, not capable of taking care of children. But the vast majority of the time, it's the sort of more covert emotional neglect where, yeah. And you'll see it's like these dynamics of like food's on the table, structure at home, everything's good. A lot of dismissive avoidant children will as adults, refer to their childhood as like idyllic, like perfect, because there's not drama and chaos. But unfortunately, there's this fly under the radar, super covert neglect where there's no emotional literacy. There's no talking about feelings. It's just absent. And because of that, a child who's actually wired for that and wired for attunement often has a deep feeling of rejection around that part of themselves not being honored. And as adults, they don't want to get close to people because they assume hurt. And so they will be the people in relationships who, when people get close to them, they suddenly get cold feet out of the blue. They suddenly want to push people away. They're afraid of commitment. They don't want to settle down because as a child, when you couldn't get something you desperately needed from a caregiver who you were constantly around, you build all these negative emotional associations to closeness because it just felt painful. And so those subconscious associations come up as an adult and try to get them to keep distance, essentially.
Would that also be the type of pattern that might lead someone to self-sabotage, proactively sabotage? I don't trust you, so I'm going to do something untrustworthy, or you're going to reject me eventually, so I'll do something that I know would make you reject me, and then test it out that way. Or does that play into this style, or is that something else?
Yes. And you could argue that both avoidant, so fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant do that. But I don't believe that there's like self-sabotage the way we think of it. Like, I don't actually believe there's really such a thing as self-sabotage. I believe that what our experience of self-sabotage is our conscious mind intending one thing, like, hey, show up and be in the relationship perhaps. And the subconscious being like, no, protect. And so what self-sabotage really is our subconscious having a different set of motives than our conscious mind's intentions. And that's what we experience as sabotage. So so to break it down that way, I agree for sure with what you're saying. But if you kind of look at it deeper, what's usually actually happening is, let's say, a dismissive avoidance, like, oh, I'm going to be in a relationship. I'm ready to settle down. That's what I want to do. Then they get into a relationship, they get closer and closer, they are afraid of vulnerability. And so their sabotage is to push you away so I can protect myself. And that's not conscious and intentional. Like, and it's not them saying, it's been 6 months. I now think I'm going to push the person away and shut them out.
It's time for me to sink the boat.
Exactly.
That's fascinating too, because as you're saying that, it hit me that even the term, right? What you're describing is emotional parts at war that are all valid and legitimate. And I wonder if the term self-sabotage undermines that a little, because it automatically shames something inherent to a symptom of an attachment disruption.
Yes,
right?
that's how I would think of it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Once again, I'm learning a lot today of the ways to look at this, and even just the phrasing, as we know in therapy, right? Terminology, vocabulary, very important. And also definitions of those things, very important. So this is, it really highlights it. I love that you talk about the perceived trauma or the perception, because I think we can get easily judgy about, well, you don't have anything to be sad about. You weren't traumatized. Or we think this only applies to people who were horribly abused, and, you know, their abuse would show up in the news. It's so bad, or whatever, just like horrible. And you're describing like there's a lot of subjectivity to it then, as far as you can't predict what would traumatize one more than another.
100%. And also, like, if we look at the way the subconscious is programmed, so I think it's really useful for people to kind of look at this construct, which is our subconscious mind gets programmed through repetition plus emotion, right? It's what essentially fires and wires neural circuitry to a degree, in a very simplified way of saying it. But if you look at repetition, you know, we can have one experience where emotion will trump, right? So like, let's say, for example, I'm driving down the street, knock on wood, God forbid, but let's say I'm driving down the street, I get hit by, you know, a car, I'm in an accident, and I can wake up that next day, try to go back in my car, and immediately I have this feeling of I am unsafe, right? I am unsafe driving a car from one event. And that's because emotion can imprint the subconscious mind immediately if it's strong enough. However, repetition plus emotion also imprint very strongly, especially across time. So somebody could arguably instead be a bad driver, drive all the time, every day that they drive to work, they almost get in an accident. They are repetitively exposed to this emotional experience of feeling unsafe, even though it's not an accident, nothing actually happens. It's still firing and wiring this way of perceiving things and storing information. And then over time, they could feel just as unsafe as somebody, you know, who's trying to get back in driving after a few months. And so it's repetition plus emotion. And the car is like a funny analogy, but like when you think of trauma doesn't have to be these big things. It can be these uncomfortable things that take place over and over again across time that can actually have a very similar impact on the way we subconsciously store and view things as a really painful single off event.
That's so interesting when you take that in terms. So what we might think of as PTSD, or just memories and echoes of trauma, could also, then it becomes actually a new re-traumatization or a new traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Is that, am I picking that up correctly?
Yes. And so like one of the analogies you could sort of think of it as is like the difference between PTSD and CPTSD, right? Your PTSD is like a set of small or like a couple single off traumatic events, whereas CPTSD, we've got sort of the sustained trauma across time, like growing up in a household, for example, with a narcissist, and somebody has this constant re-exposure to these, you know, maybe 4 out of 10 levels of trauma, you know, through manipulation or gaslighting or self-doubt. Or we could have somebody who grows up in a household with a sociopath and is exposed to a tremendous amount of violence, you know, so there's different variations of it, but essentially what matters is like people are not only carrying attachment trauma because of one-off events that are severe. People can absolutely be carrying trauma because of just uncomfortable situations they couldn't properly emotionally process and understand, and they didn't have a healthy way of resolving. And then it just happened over and over and over again, and it will get stored in a very similar way.
Well, I'm curious what you think about the practices that some of the old school practices for trauma treatment. And in my head now, I'm putting this in terms of the currency of the current nature, I should say, of the trauma versus it just being in the past. A lot of times people were always told they had to do essentially exposure therapy. Write the story down, write it 1,000,000 times, expose yourself to it while calming yourself down so it just becomes... that's complicated, though, when you talk about it's still going on. Either those memories are a re-traumatization, or, as you put it, if a caregiver is narcissistic, toxic person, they probably didn't stop being that way. And most people don't completely remove that person from their life if it's a caregiver or parent. You know, they're still around. And so are we exposing ourselves to re-trauma if we fall? Is that a possibility with exposure therapy? What do you think?
So
I'm just making this up now as I'm going along.
I love this. I love this. I mean, I'm sure you've seen a tremendous amount of people do exposure therapy and have essentially reverse effects, right? Like have some painful effects from that. And it's because exposure therapy, I believe for it to be done properly, should also be paired with like reframes cognitively. Like if somebody's doing exposure therapy, so here's what I believe about this kind of work, right? And this is actually a form of subconscious reprogramming.
Let's get into that. That's really
good. Like because it really goes hand in hand. It'll come back and tie into your question about exposure therapy. When somebody just relives the traumatic event and just repeats it back, yes, there are, in my opinion, huge elements of re-traumatization if it's not handled correctly. But I don't believe that trauma is stored just in the event itself. The real trauma is stored in what we make the trauma mean about ourselves. So for example, let's say that there is a traumatic event and somebody says, let's say somebody gets abused and they say, I am trapped, I am helpless, I am powerless, I am unsafe in the world. What happens is you could make the argument that now Sally, who was traumatized through abuse in the home at 8 years old, now Sally's 38 years old, and she still is feeling this. These things still come up. Well, how is that possible? It's 30 years ago. Well, it's only possible because the subconscious has still stored these beliefs about herself because of the inferences she made about the event. So our subconscious is very survival wired, but it wants, at the end of the day, certainty. So if Sally's abused at 8 years old, her mind will infer something about it. We'll give it meaning. So we'll say, okay, I'm abused because I'm not good enough, or I'm abused because I'm unsafe. I'm always going to be trapped. I'm always going to be helpless. So what happens is when that's imprinted to her subconscious, she still stores that and is affected by it 30 years later, not because she's necessarily even reliving the childhood memory all the time. She's reliving the meanings from the childhood memory that she's stored and seeing the world through at a subconscious level decades later. And so what I believe is, yes, we can like use things like exposure work. Like, let's say, for example, set a boundary to somebody who feels unsafe, right? Like your boss in the workplace. And we could argue that, you sort of relive these stored subconscious associations. It's sort of like going down a different rabbit hole now, but we could go back to old memories about things, but we would have to say, okay, but I'm safe now. Yes, I went through that. I'm safe now. Here's how I became safe in my adult life. Here's how I became, but I actually don't personally think that that's the most efficient way. I think that subconscious reprogramming, what we actually do, and there's a lot of different tools. We have about 21 tools or so to reprogram, but one of the ones that I find to be simple and most useful is we find what the meanings were that we gave to the traumatic event. We don't even unpack the traumatic event. We don't even have to go back into it at all because to your point, it can be re-traumatizing. We just realize that at a high level, I'm carrying this I am unsafe core wound. I am carrying this I am trapped core wound. And then what we do is we do two things. One of them is called auto-suggestion. So we take we isolate each belief. So, okay, I am trapped. And we reframe it. Okay, I'm free instead. And the subconscious mind doesn't speak through language. Okay, so that's why I don't believe in affirmations that much, because it's just like you're just feeding language.
Yeah.
Like if I were
People
to say
who
to you,
heard me on the show know that, I have an issue with. I always say I'm one of those therapists who's not a big fan of positive thinking. I always have to explain that though, because people are like, "What does that mean?"
Yeah.
But there's a certain. If you like it, you like it. If you want to hang up a poster, hang up a poster. But it's not really.
It's not going to make the impact.
No.
Exactly. And so you take the belief because of the old trauma that you're living with still. You reframe it, and then the subconscious speaks in emotion and imagery. So what we do is you're most suggestible. In other words, your subconscious is easiest to reprogram the first hour you wake up, the last hour before bed, because of the brainwave type that we're producing. And so you get people in this space to take these old beliefs they've acquired about themselves because of past trauma. We reframe them to the opposite. So I am free instead of I am trapped. I am safe instead of I am unsafe. And we get them to come up with 15 pieces of evidence per day for 21 days. You hear, 21 days to break a habit. That's because it's roughly 21 days to create strong enough neural networks that recondition. And so it has to be evidence because evidence contains memory, which contains emotion. Okay. So if I say to you, close your eyes and tell me your favorite childhood memory, you might close your eyes and tell me, and you might smile, and your body language would change, because within every memory, there's actually emotion. Now, remember what we said earlier? We said the subconscious is reprogrammed through repetition plus emotion. So what we're doing is we take this old I am trapped wound, that is why the trauma is still affecting you all this time later. We go, okay, I am free. We look for 10 to 15 pieces of evidence per day, 21 days for why you're free. And we get people to get really specific.
Wow. I like that.
So
that's very good. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite simple. Like, it sounds complicated right now, but as you go through it, so like, let's say you close your eyes, you're in that suggestible state, and you're thinking of, or you can even write it out, I am free because I'm in a free country. I am free because I no longer have unhealthy people around me. I am free because I am growing every day and making my own decisions. When you get really specific and give pieces of proof, right? You see, okay, I'm free because I've got healthy people who support my freedom around me. You think of that friend of yours, you think of, and it actually elicits an emotional response. So what you're doing is you're leveraging imagery, which the subconscious speaks in, emotion, and repetition. And this is how we actually recondition. And so, when we do that, we get a lot of valuable shifting there at the subconscious level. But then we also have to account for our behaviors, and we can make sure that we do things to express more freedom on a daily basis, like set our own boundaries, communicate our needs to people, do things that give us a sense of freedom. Yeah. And if we do that behaviorally each day while doing auto-suggestion in the morning or evening, we can actually recondition these old beliefs. And I'll tell you one more thing, and I know I'm really chatty here, but I'll tell you one more thing.
No, that's great. The listeners prefer that than to me chipping.
and so I did a lot of this work on myself. I was a fearful avoidant attachment style, and I did a lot of this work on myself. And I remember I used to share things when I would start dating somebody in a relationship, and be a couple things. I'd date somebody for long enough. It got serious enough. I felt like I had to unpack, like tell them, oh, this happened to me when I was a child. And I, did that. And I would always, tell this story when I was dating somebody, and I would feel my heart racing, and my breathing would be shallow. And I'd even get like a tiny bit sweaty. Like, I would get so nervous to tell somebody these personal things. And when I did a lot of this reprogramming, not on the trauma itself, but the meaning I gave to myself about the trauma, I am safe, or unsafe, I'm helpless, I'm powerless, I'm trapped, I'm not good enough, I'm defective, these pieces of meaning that we give. There's about 20 core ones that people give most often. But when I did a lot of reprogramming on those ideas about myself, and then I also did things to make sure that I ensured I had those things as an adult. I had my freedom, I had my safety. I did things to make myself feel that way. I remember the first time, it's actually with my husband now, where I told him some of these things. And I remember sitting down and telling him this story and feeling like it was like this distant dream. Like you're like away from it. It's not, because it's not alive in you anymore. These ideas about yourself are not a part of your personality constructs and beliefs about yourself any longer, which in my opinion is a big part of how we truly heal from these things. If we recondition these things at the subconscious level, they're not alive within us. We don't see ourselves through this lens anymore. We don't interact with ourselves through this lens anymore in the world. And so, for me, it was like I relearned how to trust. I learned to feel safe in relationships, didn't feel trapped. So when we can recondition these ideas, in my opinion, it's very much healing from the trauma without even having to go and unpack and relive all the memories of trauma itself.
Wow. Okay. The first thing that came to my mind as you were talking about, let's see, how many did you say? 15 things in each day for 21 days? Did I get the number right?
Yeah, 10 to 15 pieces of evidence.
Pieces of evidence, yeah. That's the first thing that I thought was you'd run out pretty quick. I don't know if you can reuse, but it ties in with the choices then of saying, let me do things also that show me that, because then I kind of have to, because it's like that's enough that I have to really start thinking to get some. Or can it be the same? Do I get up and list the same 10, or is that counterproductive?
Absolutely. So you're trying to elicit repetition and emotion, right? And imagery.
So it doesn't have to be novel things every time. Yeah.
It doesn't always have to be novel things. It tends to work better if you are doing novel things because, of course, you said you're doing the behaviors as well. But the main thing is it doesn't have to be huge things. Okay. So it can be, I'm free because I drove my own car to work today. I'm free because when I got to work, I was able to use my voice and make my own choices. I'm free because I chose what I wanted to eat for dinner. And it sounds funny because it's like, okay, what you wanted to eat for dinner, but like you are refeeding your subconscious mind new ideas. You're reconditioning through repetition and emotion, new ideas over and over and over again. So we do try to get like as many as you can that are new, but if you repeat some, it's going to matter a lot more that you feel about them and that you take the time to like really feel into that and visualize it, like using that imagery piece and the emotion. And if you repeat some, it doesn't make a huge difference. It doesn't make or break anything. But you can for sure at the same time.
Wow. Yeah. And that seems so useful, because then you're going to start seeing those things, because I need some for tomorrow at first, maybe, but then you're reconditioning in a way to remind yourself. It reminds me that listeners on here know that I've been doing kind of my own personal journey in the way that I'm doing therapy. I've been learning and incorporating EMDR more with my clients, and IFS more with my clients as well.
I heard you talk about the parts work a minute ago.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because in that terminology, you'd be saying that there are parts that get stuck, and they still view my part who is doing this might still view me as that vulnerable 8-year-old. It doesn't have like a little window to see my life and go, oh, wait a second. No, you're old and grown up, and you got resources, and no one's going to treat you that way, or whatever it is, right? To say that you can meet some of your needs, and you are meeting many of your needs. And so that was a tie-in for me when you say that. It's like, oh, trying to teach myself at maybe that subconscious level, trying to train myself to believe that I'm not that vulnerable anymore and that I'm safer. Is that
exactly?
You tell me.
So yes, there's a quote that I love from Dr. Gabor Mate. He says, trauma is the things that did happen that shouldn't have happened. Like somebody's abused, right? And then we give it meaning. I am unsafe. I am betrayed. I am trapped. But it's also the things that didn't happen that should have happened. Mm-hmm. And that's like being attuned to as a child, being able to express yourself emotionally, being able to. And so in the context that you're saying, the way that I think of this as, and again, it's like a lot of similar things, but in different sort of formats, is that we have core wounds, which are these deep subconscious ideas we have about ourselves because of the things that happened that shouldn't have happened. The abuse, the bad divorce, the unsafety in the home, like these dynamics. Whereas there's also the things that didn't happen that should have happened. And that's that you had unmet needs as a child. And so what we have to do is we use our conscious mind to essentially reparent our subconscious mind by figuring out the biggest unmet needs that we had as children. And of course, the interesting thing about the subconscious is that it determines the relationship you have to yourself. So if you take a dismissive avoidant, they got a lack of emotional nurturing in childhood, a lack of attunement emotionally. Guess who is the greatest neglector of their own emotions as an adult? Also the dismissive avoidant. So what you'll see is that we have to isolate the biggest unmet needs that we had, and we have to learn to give those to ourselves. And that's kind of more what you were saying with the parts work, is to see those, sort of re-nurturing those components and giving to ourselves what we didn't have access to, in a sense. And I think of that as more of like the unmet needs side rather than the core wound side. But I find that if we do both of those things, we change the painful ideas we have about ourselves because of trauma, and we give to ourselves what we couldn't access in times of trauma, those two things have a profound healing impact on the subconscious.
What are your thoughts about the usefulness or modern usefulness, current usefulness of diagnoses? I know some of these techniques and things don't necessarily differentiate so much by diagnosis as they do by other factors like attachment style and things.
I think that they're super beneficial. Absolutely. And I think that they're beneficial in the sense that they can help more clearly isolate a problem, which in order to solve anything, isolating it clearly is the first step. But I think that there's, that can't be the end road. Like it can't be, okay, now you have this diagnosis. Now you, hopefully that's not happening too much overall, but I do think there's an element of making sure that, if somebody's diagnosed with something, they don't just see themselves as this new identity forever, because that can have its own detriments to it. They take that information to more clearly isolate root cause of different issues and be able to dive in and heal at that level.
Interesting. I worked in a place in community mental health oftentimes, and this was literal in the building I worked in. You'd walk in, and if you were in the substance abuse treatment program, you'd walk to the right. And if you were in the mental health treatment programs, you'd walk to the left, to that wing of the building. And that's fine. Obviously, there's little wrinkles to things that are different. However, I caught on at some point that many of those in the administration, especially those who were maybe not clinicians themselves, they looked at that as like, oh, so which side of the house should they be on, right? Which should they be down here or down here? And it's like, I think there's some wrinkles, kind of maybe a similar vibe to what you're saying. Yeah, but really, it wasn't like we were doing something weighed. I worked in the substance abuse wing for most of my time there, although I kind of floated around. My office stayed in the same place physically, but I worked for both departments over time. And I noticed that I don't do anything that different from, it was all mental health. It was all mental health. All right. It's all mental, psychological, emotional health. And and it's really interesting that a lot of these approaches, information, tools, reframes are useful across the board, for people without being like, oh, you're OCD, go in this room or whatever.
Absolutely. And it's funny because so the things that we focus on from an attachment theory perspective is we focus on reprogramming core wounds, right? So breaking through limiting beliefs, these sorts of things, learning to meet your unmet needs, doing emotional regulation work through somatic processing techniques, right? Actually re-regulating your nervous system, all those sorts of things. And then we work on boundaries, communication, and behaviors, reconditioning behaviors. So if your, behavior is to, drink all the wine in the house when you feel stressed, we can actually recondition some of the relationship to that based on positive versus negative emotional associations that are stored subconsciously. That's kind of we can go down that rabbit hole in a second, but it's funny because if you target these 6 major things for anybody, they recondition these old painful ideas that they have about themselves or the world. You help them meet these deep unmet needs that they didn't have access to and that they're hurting over. You retrain their nervous system. You help them become able to communicate and set boundaries in their lives. And then you can do some behavior work. These things together, whether that's helping with addiction, whether that's helping with attachment style dynamics, whether that's helping with, success pain points that you're struggling through in your career, these things at root level, just to your point, the root causes of different dynamics. So they bleed out into everything essentially.
Yeah. Well, it's such a great thing to be aware of. And I'm glad to see people aggressively using that. When I started practicing, it was just unfortunately uncommon that people would even ever talk about attachment, even in case staffings. And they definitely weren't educating people and teaching them about that with their kids or with their own selves. And so I'm so glad that this is a trend, and I'm glad that there are people out there that are doing this work that you're doing. Everybody who comes on the show, I want to give a chance for you to tell everybody a little bit about the work you are doing, where they can find you. But first, I want to ask my traditional question about charitable efforts. Do you have any kind of charities, nonprofits, or ways that you'd suggest people give back to the community, something near and dear to your heart, whether or not it's related to this topic?
Yeah. So, one thing so we do something on YouTube where we actually take 4 of our videos every single month, and we actually just donate the proceeds from there to, different charities. And we actually let our audience decide. But I would say the one that's
cool.
Yeah, it's just we put out tons of videos. And so it's sort of a fun thing to do. And so we constantly have some in there. But I would say that the thing that is most beneficial for us here in Canada is the Sick Kids Foundation. And so what they do is they, and it's a great thing to donate to, is they have different children who are struggling with cancer at a young age or just other ailments. And they'll do these really nice things, take them on, really special trips if they're terminally ill, just plan family vacations for them, allow them to, be funded to just do really nice things and have these beautiful experiences if they can't afford them. So, very much worth looking into if anybody's looking for a good cause to get involved with. Maybe I can send you a link or something if you want to check that out.
Awesome.
As well.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to. And say the name of it one more time so everyone can Google it, and then we'll try to put the link up too when you send it to me.
Yeah, it's called Sick Kids.
Sick Kids. Okay. Gotcha. If they Google Sick Kids Canada, you're probably going to find it. That's That's very inspirational as well, because sometimes some of those things fall through the cracks when it's like, oh, you're sick, you're just lucky to survive, right? And it's like we put so much emphasis on that, we don't think about some of those other aspects of life and how that can impact health. I appreciate that very much, very much. Well, tell people a little bit about your program and where they can find out and benefit from that.
So we are located at personaldevelopmentschool.com, and we actually have a free attachment style test you can take on there. So if anybody's interested in getting like their attachment style with an attachment report, that's all available on there. And then I put out daily content on YouTube. So lots of, tutorials on there and information about the subconscious and how it works and your attachment style and just different ways of operating. And that is Personal Development School Thais Gibson.
Say that one more time. For me, mostly I'm writing it down. Sorry.
That's okay. Personal Development School Thais Gibson.
That's on YouTube. That's the YouTube channel.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Anywhere in the socials, or is that basically that's most of where
those are the main ones? But you can also go to Instagram. Personal Development _school is there too.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody out there checks it out. Also, if you dig deep, as those out there know, I'm a big fan of advocacy and reaching out in your life. I will say this, as I say often about addiction and as I say about trauma, you might think to yourself, do I have anyone that I know that's going through any of this? And I'll tell you right now, the answer is yes. So if you look around in your life, you're going to see people who are struggling with things that have to do with attachment, maybe when we look in the mirror even. And so it's something to keep in mind and to share and put that on your personal radar as well. Want to thank everybody out there for listening today. And if you would like to get involved with the program, if you'd like to support or play a role, we have a new link up. You can go to dwighthurst.com/support. It's kind of got everything under there. There's a couple different ways to support the show. And rather than just mention them all every single time, everybody can go there if you'd like to get involved in that. Also, follow us on socials as well, at Break a Brain on Twitter, facebook.com/breakabrain as well. And I've been doing more and more on Instagram. And that one is at Brainiacs Ahoy, because Break a Brain it was already used on Instagram. So you can check that out there. This month I've been doing a series of what we're calling the Arkham Asylum intern, where I'm diagnosing Batman villains, and it's kind of fun and silly, but also a way to showcase how we diagnose and make treatment planning too. So hopefully everybody can check that out on Brainiacs Ahoy on Instagram. So Thais, thank you so much for joining today. Really, really grateful to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtamparts.com.